In this presentation, Professor DeGrave is going to tell us a little bit more about some of the regions in Latin America. This presentation should illuminate your reading that you'll be reading later on in Chapter 2 of Clausen.
All right, Mexico. We'll start there since they're our next door neighbor. What do we know about Mexico? So we'll give you a little mini pop quiz. One question. What is the name of this river that divides Texas from Mexico? And I'm not going to give it away just yet, so write your answer down or keep it in mind. So we have a name for that river, we folks in the United States. Is it this? Is it Rio Bravo? Rio Grande? Both of those? None of those? And what's interesting is if you talk to someone from Mexico, they call what we think of as the Rio Grande, or some people say the Rio Grande River. For folks from Mexico, call it the Rio Bravo. So kind of getting back to what is Latin America, who's defining it, why are they defining it. We, the United States, may have our terms for various names of places, but obviously not everybody is going to have the same name for every place on planet Earth. All right. So here's our map of Middle America, and as you can see, there are two major components of Middle America. There's Central America, those countries that are connected by land, and the Caribbean, which is mostly composed of islands. And as you can see, there are many, 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 many tiny little islands to the east. Maybe we're more familiar with the bigger ones, such as Cuba, or the island of Hispaniola, which has Haiti and Dominican Republic on it. But many, many small islands, some of them still not independent countries. Many of them are still colonies of Britain, some of the U.S., and other countries as well. So here's our close-up map of Central America, and of course this is a very strategic piece of land. It's a very skinny chunk of land, and it's called an isthmus, right? An isthmus is a skinny, small, narrow piece of land that connects two larger land masses. So you could argue the isthmus connects North America with South America, or something of this nature. Of course, in Madison, most famous, perhaps the most famous isthmus that any of us generally will encounter. It's that narrow strip of land between Lake Mendota and Lake Monona, right where the capital is located. So hopefully, knowing Madison, that'll help you remember the isthmus. And perhaps it makes the isthmus, the Panamanian Isthmus is what this is called most famously, right, is the Panama Canal. Because this land is so narrow, you could put a canal through it relatively easily compared to trying to cross Mexico with a canal, or Nicaragua, or another country where the land is a little bit wider. And of course here is our isthmus in Madison as well. Looking at South America, we have a couple sub-regions we want to think about because they're all a little bit different. The Caribbean, I know you're thinking, wait, isn't the Caribbean just a sea with a bunch of islands? Well, sort of. There's a lot of history with the Caribbean of not just the islands, but folks who settled along the shore of the continental land masses of North and South America. So we think of Caribbean South America as basically being the north coast of Venezuela, as well as with the Guyanas, right? There's Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana. They were all named Guyana at one point in time. Guyana was British Guyana, Suriname was Dutch Guyana, and French Guyana is still a French colony today. Pretty interesting. If you go to French Guyana, they use the euro as their currency. The capital of French Guyana is Paris, France. It is not an independent country, and makes it very unique. But those three little tiny countries we generally refer to as the Guyanas have a very unique history. They're much more similar to Caribbean countries, histories of slavery, significant African populations, as well as very extreme colonialism. In fact, French Guyana was a French penal colony, and this is very typical of these three small countries that are often forgotten. The Andean region basically refers to the mountains. We talked a little bit about the Altiplano and so on. Amazonia, basically not only the rainforest, but the savannas around the rainforest, and the Amazon River, of course. And the southern cone, sort of that triangular region, south of Brazil, that generally includes Argentina and Chile, and sometimes a little bit of Uruguay, Brazil, and Bolivia. So when we talk about, again, the physical geography of Latin America, as we mentioned, mostly located in the tropics. And not only are they very much affected by their latitudes, being within the tropics, but also some major natural Earth events such as earthquakes, volcanoes, and hurricanes. We'll talk a little bit about that, why that is in just a moment. Right, first we'll mention the activity underground in much of Latin America, particularly along its west coast. And we can see that they are part of a larger system called the Ring of Fire. And what that refers to is a ring around the Pacific Ocean that is very active. And when you think of where do earthquakes happen, where do tsunamis happen, where do major volcanoes exist, many of those you'll find along the Ring of Fire, whether they're in Latin America, the U.S., Japan, Indonesia. Thinking of the most recent tsunami, it hit Japan because there was an earthquake just off the coast of Japan. The previous tsunami, there was an earthquake across just off the coast of Indonesia in the Sunda Trench on the left side of this map. But the bottom line is this is a huge plate, the Pacific Plate. The Earth is composed of these plates, and when these plates move, crazy things happen, particularly either right where the plate meets, either one plate will go below one or one will go above one, or they'll just collide into one another. And we don't need to get into all the geology of it, but just have a good idea what the Ring of Fire is and why it is that we tend to find a lot of this type of activity, seismic activity, along the borders of this huge Pacific Plate. And again, this is the ring. So not only do you find earthquakes, but also other tectonic forces related to the plates where they come together are volcanoes. And some of the world's largest and most active volcanoes are in Latin America. And what's interesting is you can go to Latin America and you can surf down an active volcano, which is always interesting. And, you know, make sure you don't want to give all your details to the parents until after you've come home and survived surfing down an active volcano. So unfortunately, many volcanoes are near populated areas. Volcanic ash is very fertile soil, so historically people have settled on, near, or around volcanoes, even though they provide this great way of survival and crops to eat. They also will take life away equally as quickly, as we know, through major eruptions. And when we think of volcanoes, they are generally part of long mountain ranges. Volcanoes, in effect, are mountains, and the same processes that cause the creation of volcanoes are the same ones that create mountains, such as the Andes. So here's a map of, you can see Central America, and the entire western flank of Central America is dotted by a series of volcanoes. And if we had all the volcanoes that are either extinct or dormant on this map as well, we would have hundreds and hundreds of volcanoes. These are the ones that are active, or as you can see, potentially active, meaning that they've been active relatively recently, but we haven't heard from them in a while. So we'll take a look at Momotombo. This is a volcano in Nicaragua, and you can see also those two lakes. There's Lake Managua and Lake Nicaragua. Those lakes were formed due to tectonic activity of eruptions and earthquakes, and the land would eventually collapse and filled with water, more or less. So here's Momotombo, and if you've never seen a volcano before, it looks just like a volcano. If you were in first grade and someone said, draw what a volcano looks like, you might draw something like this. And so volcanoes are pretty unmistakable, and Momotombo is certainly one of the more famous ones. If you look to the right in this photo behind the sign, that is an old half-eroded volcano from millions of years ago that was probably the size of Momotombo or greater, but eventually it went extinct, and through erosional forces you can see it's just more a bump on the horizon now as compared to this very symmetrical and volcano-esque land feature that we look at as Momotombo. So one example of the forces and the danger of volcanoes being near populated areas. Here's the city of León, Nicaragua, which is very near to Momotombo. If you go back to the map that we just looked at a moment ago, it's an old colonial city. This is the big cathedral in León. And a little side note about this story, well, León means lion, so you can see the lions in the foreground. But the church was falling into disrepair. It was getting corrosion on it. You can see the top story of the cathedral there is very dark. The bottom is much whiter. So they said in Nicaragua one day, let's paint the church and they got about halfway done, and folks said, you know, we kind of like that old dark corroded look, so stop painting. So if you're wondering why that church, the top of it is darker and the bottom is lighter, it's because they liked that old kind of rustic look of hundreds of years of erosion and pollution and so on working on the building. But look around the corner from the church. This is the side of the church, and where that red arrow is pointing, you can see Momotombo hiding in the background. And again, this is an active volcano. And imagine, right, if Momotombo were to erupt, you have all these people in this big city. You know, they would have to flee in a matter of minutes, or lava, rocks, ash, and so on would have burned them alive, like if any of you have ever been to Pompeii in Italy. So very, very, very threatening. The huge population of people, not just in Nicaragua, but in Mexico and a number of other countries, Ecuador, Chile, and so on, where there's a lot of volcanic activity, and ultimately this is a high-risk proposition. One of these days, one of these volcanoes is going to erupt, and unfortunately we'll probably have a major catastrophe on our hands. Here's a map of seismic activity over the last few years. This map is a couple years old, but you get the idea that you can really see the ring of fire in and around the Pacific Ocean, and that when we hear about, you know, tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanoes erupting, and someone might say, oh my gosh, you know, it's a sign of end times, the world is coming to an end. But we can map this, and we know that it is a regular occurrence to have eruptions in and around and along the ring of fire all the way around the Pacific Ocean. If you follow the ring of fire around the U.S. and Latin America and so on, and you get to the very bottom, the southern portion where it's near Antarctica, you see little purple dots down there. That is the southern edge of the Pacific plate, this big plate in the middle that is basically one big chunk of land underneath the Pacific Ocean. But nonetheless, you get the idea. Earthquakes, volcanoes are no surprise in Latin America, and in fact, we've plotted the history of seismic activity for years and years and years and years. And so when one of these incidents happen, it really isn't a surprise. It's just a question of where and when, not if. And here we can see I kind of superimposed an image of these plates that I've been referring to over the map. And you can see that the Nazca Plate is just off the west coast of South America, and the Cocos Plate is just north of that. To the west of that, the sort of light brownish color, that is the Pacific Plate, and that is a very large plate. And so when that plate moves, all these other tiny ones, like the Caribbean Plate, the Cocos Plate, and the Nazca Plate, they get crushed by that larger one. They move, and then we have a disturbance underneath the surface of the Earth, and this is why we have earthquakes and volcanoes and so on. But the Caribbean Plate certainly is one of the most movable ones because it's very small. The South American Plate, as you can see to the lower right, is very big as well. So if the South American Plate is coming in from one side and the Pacific Plate from the other, these little tiny ones like the Cocos Plate and the Caribbean Plate are going to move a lot because they're just a lot smaller and get pushed around. And unfortunately, this is where things like the earthquake in Haiti happened a few years ago underneath where the Caribbean Plate meets what is the North American Plate. So of course we've got volcanoes, we've got earthquakes, but as we also we've got hurricanes, and this is Hurricane Hugo, named after our dog. Actually, no, our dog wasn't born yet, but nonetheless, you can look at Hugo, and what I'd like you to do is put your fingers up to the screen and get an idea of how big that hurricane is, right? Compare it to, take your fingers and sort of measure how big that hurricane is, and now compare that to the size of the country of Cuba, right? And you get the idea. This is a huge, huge, huge storm that spans many hundreds of miles. When we have storms here in the Midwest, they kind of blow through town and they're gone in a half an hour sometimes and things of this nature. Hurricanes, some of them have extended over 1,000 miles. And so if you're on a tiny island in the Caribbean and all of a sudden you've got a storm that's 1,000 miles in diameter every direction, what do you do? Where do you go? And so you can see the likelihood for disaster is extremely high. So keep that in mind, that hurricanes are very, very, very large and powerful storms. And if you're on a small island, there's nowhere for you to run. We can see that obviously the hurricanes have had a huge impact in Latin America. And these are just some of the more recent ones, some that are of more significant destruction. When we talk about hurricanes, most of those are, generally speaking, in the northern hemisphere. They're north of the equator. for various reasons of wind and water currents. But perhaps most famously in Central America anyway is Hurricane Mitch in 1998 that you can see between 11 and 18,000 people died, cost over $6 billion in damage, and still these countries are still reeling from that hurricane that happened so many years ago. Pretty amazing to think of the impacts, right? And when you think of countries like Nicaragua and Honduras, they may not be the richest countries on earth. And so imagine, right, if you're already struggling, you live in an impoverished country, and then a hurricane like Mitch comes and just destroys everything you have. How do you recover from that? And we can see that this is unfortunately what happened in Haiti a few years ago with the earthquake. They started with nothing. The earthquake took away so much more, and now they're still struggling just to try to get back to some minimal level of poverty. And it's very difficult for many folks in these countries to recover from such incidents.
So it is time for your pop quiz. Again, take a moment to write down your answers, pause the video, and when you're ready you can resume it and check and see if you were right. Number 1, which of the following are related to the shifting of underground plates? That is going to be all of the above. The formation of mountains, the formation of volcanoes, which remember are a subset of mountains, just a kind of mountains, as well as earthquakes. Number 2, Honduras and Nicaragua have not yet recovered from the destruction caused by Hurricane Mitch in '98. That is true. And number 3, Central America and Middle America refer to the same place. That is not true. Central America includes both Middle America, the Isthmus, as well as the islands of the Caribbean.